I suppose I've got known for some of my hairs. Here's some of the wintry ones that I did earlier. I'm just putting in the background at the moment very quickly and loosely. I'm not worrying about detail. I just want something of the colours and the tones that I'm going to use. I want to put something down so the moon glows against it, and I also give a little bit of directional light to the hair. I'm really just filling in all the background, as I say, and I'm sort of testing out just what tone I want and how dark I need to go. But all the time, even though it's a bit of a mess at the moment, I am aware that I can layer up, and I will, even when I've finished the hair and all the foreground, I'll be able to be playing one against the other, and I'll come back to it. And that's why I'm blasting it in so quickly. Not quite as quick as it looks like I am, but quick nevertheless. You've just got to not worry about it and get that background in, because really my main concern is showing you how to paint the hair at the moment. So I just know that I want that moon to be glowing against it. I don't want the deep, rich blues that I've gone for sometimes, which automatically make the moon glow. I want something a bit subtler because I'm going to have really lovely icy colours all around. So I'm keeping it a little bit cooler and softer. I'm keeping the foreground quite wet and adding a little bit of movement and interest because I know I'm keeping it simple in the background so the hare's head stands out against it. And as I come towards the foreground, I want quite a bit of movement and sort of scrubby undergrowth going on with rich terracotta hues that I can then come on darker and darker and darker and eventually splash a little bit of ice and frosty looking stuff on top of it. But you'll see as I go along, but that bit will probably be speeded up. There's so many things I could go into in detail, but there's always other little tutorials that I can do to go into that. So I'm just paying attention really with this on the eyes and the fur. But it's nice to splash in this. And you can see also how things build up and that you don't have to be too precious at this time because it really, really is the background. So much is coming up on top of this that if you spent time, I mean, you could spend ages and ages building up tiny, tiny detail. There really is no need at this point. If you want to do that later, then of course those final brighter colours on top of this can give you that detail you want. And the main thing about any wildlife, I always think, is what the eye looks like. So I'm always in a rush to get to the eye, but I want to do some of the darkness around it. So I'm just going to lay in some tones so that I can work against that with all the colours within the eye and the hair around it. So again, just like with the background, at this point you really don't want to worry too much. It's just getting down some of that colour so you can see the darks and the lights. And while I'm doing this, I sometimes tend to, just as some of the underpainting, give a little bit of texture, because when I put the actual marks of the fur in, it'll sit underneath and give something extra to the whole layering really, and it gives it that little bit of realism. This always looks a bit of a mess at this point, but don't worry, you know that you're going to come on top and do all sorts of different things to bring it together. And as I say, it's just getting in some of those tones so that you know what's happening. Another beautiful thing with this board is that acrylic sits quite interestingly on the top, and you can already get some of those little marks, and you can get directional marks so you can see which way the fur's growing on the face, and it just tells you already, even though you're hardly doing anything, what's going to happen. Loads of work to come on top of this, but this is how I just sort of start to see them. We've hardly done anything, it's just that I'm using the acrylic quite wet so that I can lift it, work into it, just make a little bit of texture. So a lot of this body, I'm going to move to a larger brush now. A lot of this body is going to be covered, but I do want to be able to see through all the reeds and the grasses. So I will be working into it and making it look very 3D and furry. Now at this point I'll just say, whenever you're doing wildlife, whatever you're painting, you've always got to be aware of the direction of light, because that eventually, when you start putting in the different tones, is going to give him the three-dimensional feel. So I'm going to, okay, the light's slightly behind him, but I'm saying that the light is mainly coming from here. Having said that, I will show a bit of light through the ear, because I think it's lovely when you get that bright, shining light through part of the ear, and to get that I'll be doing a bright patch. It will look much nicer than this in the end, but I'm just telling myself at this point that I'm going to have a bright patch shining through all that hair, just to look as though it's lit up from behind. It'll go dark here, but just the background colours that we'll work into. Let's put a bit of texture on because it's looking a bit weird. Right, so he's nearly ready to start with the eye. Now I know that there's light and dark around the eye, but I'll work on that. So now I'm starting on the eye. I'm going on to a much smaller brush. And it is a size 3 and it goes to a bit of a point. And I'm going to start with the colour in the background because that needs to dry once I've done it. And we have a very bright eye. If I do the mid-tone first, I can go darker at the top where it's slightly in shadow, and then brighter. And I'm just going to blast in the black pupil, which is absolutely massive, so that on top of that, once it's dry, I can put that shine from the moon and, of course, everything that's around the eye. And there's such huge eyes that hares have. Everything gets reflected in it, so sometimes if you get really good photos you can see the horizon and the trees reflected in it, but here there will be one bright shining patch. So I'm now doing the dark around the edge. At the moment everything's still wet, but it doesn't mean that I can't start putting in some of this detail. The quicker I get it in, the quicker it'll dry and I can work into it. So the pupil's slightly raised towards the moon, because he needs to look as though he's looking at it. And although I'll put a bit more detail and put eyelashes in, because I do slightly Disneyfy my hair. They're not entirely realistic, even though they're based in realism. I do cutesify them a little bit. So I'll be putting a little bit of detail in that. Again, at the moment, I'm just putting in the darks to tell myself where they are and fit some of that in. I might even, dare I say, give them ever such a slight smile. So I'm letting that eye dry. Now around the edge of the eye there's always a little bit of light fur. It gets a lot lighter, so I'll start putting that in, even though I'll have to come in with finer detail later. It's just that building up of tone, so it starts bit by bit to look right. So just little tiny marks, building that up, because then over the top of that I'll have some of the hairs. When I say hairs, I mean fur. So now I'm working further in the eye, and I'm just putting this dark bit up because, of course, where the, well, it would be the eyelid or the hair or the eyelashes shade the eye at the top, it's always really quite dark. And of course if you put the darks in, then the lights will shine even brighter against them. So I'm working on darkening the pupil, putting that really dark, rich brown for the shadow at the top of the eye. And I'm just working around the eye really, just to give it a little bit more emphasis, and I'm finding out what shape I use, because of course you can change the whole character of something in the way that you shape the eye. It can look cute, it can look interested, it can look scared, so you've got to be quite careful how you go about it. So I'm putting in some of the fur in the light areas around the eye now, and I'll slowly work the dark into the light into the dark, and it just builds up and builds up in that way. For this painting I'm using a lot of light at first on top of these background textures to suggest the fur. Very often you'll use mid-tones as well, and then come light on top of that, but you'll see later why I'm doing it this way, because I'm going to use a glaze just by way of demonstrating how in acrylics, once everything's dry underneath, a glaze is a perfect way of bringing all the colours together and toning everything down, and then on top of that you can come in with the real thin, bright, detailed highlights. So really this is me just, again, all these build-up of layers are doing two things. They're telling me where the light's hitting it. They're slowly building up a feeling of fur in the background that I'll work on top of. And you'll be able to see a history of all these little marks zuzzing through, so it won't all be flat and it won't be kind of graphic. It'll be more painterly and it'll all be moving around quite a lot. Building up some of that eye and eyelash just to get the general feel of its expression, because after this I'm going to have to put some of the highlights in, and I like to get that large, kind of innocent looking eye, and of course the darker the lashes and surround at the top, and because it's looking up it gives it that kind of innocence, which is quite nice for wildlife. And as I say, I am cutesifying these a little bit, so I like to give it that expression. If I was doing an incredibly realistic wildlife painting, I could go about it the same way with the techniques, but I'd be doing a lot more looking back at the reference and making absolutely sure I got it accurate. With this, I'm kind of making a lot of it up. It's more of an illustrative style, but using those painterly techniques to create it. Just emphasising that eye. And very often when you're painting these things, you go backwards and forwards with light and dark and mid-tone, backwards and forwards. It doesn't always just happen. You can just do it one off, but I think sometimes these layers help with the final work. Now, with any eye, because it's rounded, you're going to get these reflections, and they're going to be in an arc which describes the surface of the eye. So I'm putting in the blue, which is the surrounding colour of the sky, which will be showing, and the skyline might be showing. I'm kind of painting wet on wet, but I'm going to put a little highlight in now. It gets brighter and brighter and brighter until you get that final bright moon highlight, which will be searing white, but I might have to put the final bit in when everything's dry, because as I say, because I'm speeding up for this, I'm working with it a little bit wet. That can be a help because it helps the colours blend into each other, but when you want it there's real brights, it can be a bit of a hindrance. But here we go, it's just starting now with these little highlights to suggest that shine. And of course in the iris of the eye, curving round, it'll be picking up bits of highlight, so that gives it that wet sheen as well. So I've just put those in, and I may go brighter later on. Just adding a little bit more blue now because it was blending in with the black, and that's the problem with not letting it dry. But so far so good. Now of course this black surround to the eye gets wet, and to show that wetness it has little subtle highlights in, whether it's a sort of softish browny colour, whether it's a blue because it's reflecting the sky again, and just adding those makes it look slightly damp and not just like a hard outer line. So that's what I'm adding now. Around the edge where the eyeball meets the surround of the eye, of course because it's wet there, if you put tiny dots like this, again it looks wetter. It's not crying, it's just excited at the moon. But you can see how it's suddenly just adding those little highlights makes all the difference. A little bit more fur detail. You can see how it's just a steady build up, and I'm looking all the time and referring to bits and pieces and seeing what I think. So I'm going to speed things up for you a bit now because this could take some time.